Good evening, or morning, or afternoon, whatever time zone you happen to be in at the moment. This is Lawrence Holgate, the host of Understanding Plato, and the author of the book, Understanding Plato. Today we're going to continue with Republic. This will be in Book 5 of Republic, and the topic is women, marriage, and children. At the beginning of Book 5, Socrates is about to describe the four types of deficient city governments and the corresponding souls of private individuals, when he's interrupted by Adeimantus, the brother of Glaucon. He complains that Socrates had earlier mentioned, but has yet to explain, that in a city with a perfect constitution, quote, as regards women and children, anyone could see that it will be a case of friends sharing everything in common. That quote is from Book 5, paragraph 449c. Socrates accedes to Adeimantus and his demand for clarification, and he lays out the details of a radical proposal for how marriages should be regulated, the role of women, and the distribution of children in the guardian class. Think about that word, the distribution of children. Now, some of these proposals would not only be regarded as radical by 21st century readers of the Republic, but as Plato has Socrates admit, they would also be regarded as radical by his fellow 4th century Athenians. Moreover, Plato's recommendations for the equality of women were so far ahead of his time that they were not enacted as law in most Western countries until the 20th century. We must also notice that the recommendations Plato gives for marriage and the status of women and children apply only to the guardian class and the soldiers, the auxiliary classes of the ideal city. He did not intend to make these proposals that we're going to hear to apply to women or men in the much larger class of wage earners or money makers, as we know, as the terms that he uses for the largest class in the city. So we begin with women. Socrates begins his discussion with the reminder that a basic organizing principle of the ideal city-state is the principle of natural division of labor, the principle that we've already heard in Book 4. Each person must do one job for which he or she is naturally suited. Now, this principle is reintroduced with a view to understanding how it might be applied to the role of women. But first, Socrates says, there's a problem of vagueness that must be solved before the principle of natural division of labor can be applied. It is admitted that all men and women have different natures, but this tells us nothing about the jobs or the tasks that they should perform unless we know whether this difference is relevant to the job or task in question. Socrates cites an example of bald and long-haired men. It would be ridiculous, he says, to forbid the long-haired ones to be shoemakers if that is what the bald ones are to be, or vice versa. In other words, the absence or presence of hair is not relevant to the task of shoemaking. Now let's see how he applies this. The question is whether the natural differences between women and men are relevant to the task of ruling, to the task of guardianship. Until this question is answered, we can't make a meaningful application of the principle of natural division of labor. Socrates answers the question in 2 steps. First, he provides a standard for what counts as being naturally suited to a task. Namely, the person must learn the task easily, need little instruction and attention, and retain what he or she is taught, and her or his bodily capacities must adequately serve the mind. That is, she or he must be able to do what she or he decides to do. What I'm reading out of is paragraphs 455b to 455c, if you have the actual Republic in front of you. Second, Socrates makes the empirical observation that women must meet this standard. He says, there is no pursuit relevant to the management of the city that belongs to a woman because she is a woman, or to a man because he is a man. As it is with men, and so it is with women. One is suited for medicine, another is not. One is suited for physical training or war, another is not. One is a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and another is not. One is spirited, another is not. Socrates concludes from these observations that there is also a woman who is suited to be a guardian, and one who is not. A woman can have the same nature as a man, a nature that is relevant to guarding the city, except to the extent that she is weaker and he is stronger. He tosses that off at 456a. He later tells us that the lighter tasks should be assigned to the guardian women because of their relative weakness. Now, none of Plato's liberal ideas about the equality of women shakes his assumption that human beings generally are unequal by nature, and that social roles should be assigned on the basis of this natural inequality, with only a few women assigned to the task of guardians of the city. This assumption does not change until the 18th century with the advent of the idea of natural rights, ideally possessed equally by all persons. There is no concept of natural rights in ancient Greek philosophy, certainly not in the Republic. Finally, Socrates' remarks about the equal status of women are limited to those in the guardian class, as I've already said, and they have no application to the women in the other classes of the city. For example, in his later discussion of democracy, he takes it as a serious defect of this form of constitution that it gives legal equality and freedom to women in relation to men. Democracy has no friend in Socrates. By the way, respectable, well-to-do women lived very secluded lives in most Greek states. They were confined to the household and to domestic work, and were largely excluded from the public spheres of culture, politics, and warfare. So Socrates is very much a pioneer, although, as I said, he restricts his equality principle, the principle of natural division of labor, to women in the guardian class. Let's turn now to the idea of marriage and what Socrates says about it, or what Plato says about it through the voice of Socrates. Sexual relations between men and women of the auxiliary or the soldier class and those who are guardians in training must be managed by the rulers in the same way that hunting dogs and noble birds are allowed to breed. Experienced breeders know that these animals are kept from unregulated sexual intercourse because of the possibility that this would produce inferior dogs and inferior birds. Instead, such breeding is carefully regulated so that only the best of them marries, quote, end quote, and breeds with the best. In order to accomplish these goals for human beings in the guardian and auxiliary classes, Socrates suggests that lies and deception be used by the rulers to ensure that the best men should mate with the best women in as many cases as possible, while the opposite should hold of the worst men and women. Socrates doesn't give any details about how these pairings of men and women are to be accomplished, except to remark that there will be times of the year for the prime young guardians to mate, at which time, quote, sophisticated lotteries will have to be created so that an inferior person of that sort will blame chance rather than the rulers at each mating time. Very clever, isn't it? Moreover, he says, those young men who are good at war or at other things must, among other prizes and rewards, be given a greater opportunity to have sex with the women, in order that a pretext may also be created at the same time for having as many children as possibly fathered by such men. Paragraph 460b. Now, it's interesting to note that although marriage is thought to be necessary to avoid a charge of impiety, the only constraint on sexual relations between men and women in the guardian and auxiliary classes is that the best men and the best women should have sexual relations only with each other. The idea of regulated marriage does not mean that marriage is only between one man and one woman, but between any man and any woman who rank among the best of the class. It is for this reason that some have interpreted these passages to imply that all female guardians are shared by all the male guardians. There is no particular woman that any male guardian can claim as his, though, in the sense of belonging to him, nor can any female guardian claim any man as my man, my own. This is consistent with the earlier proposal of Socrates that the guardians will be stripped of all private property and they will live together sharing dwellings and meals. We'll have more of that later. If the accumulation of private property can have a corrupting influence on a guardian, then exclusive sexual access to a particular person can be even more distracting and destructive to the ultimate purpose of guardianship, that is, the good of the city. And there are other restrictions that he imposes on sexual relationships. Because offspring should be bred only from parents who are in their prime, Socrates calculates, quote, that a woman should bear children for the city from the age of 20 to that of 40, whereas a man should beget them for the city from the age of 25 to 55, end quote. Any male who is older or younger than this and fathers a child will escape punishment, but the child, quote, will be begotten and born without the benefit of sacrifices or the benefit of prayers that are offered by the priests and priestesses at city festivals. He or she will be born in darkness through a terrible act of lack of self-control. Socrates adds that the same law will apply if a man is still of breeding age and has sex with a woman in her prime when the rulers have not mated them. Let me repeat that. Socrates says the same law will apply if a man who is still of breeding age has sex with a woman in her prime when the rulers have not mated them. The child will suffer the shame of illegitimacy for the rest of its life if this is how that child is born. Most restrictions on sexual relationships in the guardian class, the ruling class, are lifted after women and men have passed breeding age, except those in consanguineous relationships, that is, blood relationships. So Socrates says a man may not have sex with his daughter, mother, daughter's daughters, or mother's female ancestors, or a woman with her son and his descendants, or her father and his ancestors. That's quite a list. A single fetus born as a result of such relationship shall be, quote, disposed of. Socrates offers no justification for these restrictions, but we can gather from this that this is something that is an idea that was strongly held in ancient Greece. We turn now to children. When a child is born to good parents, as we've described above, those who are mated properly, then they will be taken to a rearing pen and handed over to special nurses who live in a separate part of the city. That is, the parents at birth must give up the child. If the child is deformed or born to inferior parents, then it will be hidden in a sacred and unknown place and left to die by exposure. By the way, infanticide by exposure was commonly used in ancient Greece as a method of family planning. Removal from the biological parents is necessary in order to ensure that no person will recognize their own biological child and no child will recognize their own parent. Instead, from the day that a man becomes a bridegroom, he will call all offspring born in the 10th month afterward his sons, if they are male, and his daughters, if they are female, and they will call him father. All of the children born at the same time will call one another brothers and sisters. If 50 children are born to 25 sets of biological parents in the month of April, let's say, then each child will have 25 mothers and 25 fathers and 49 brothers and sisters. Each parent will have 50 children, and their future children will be called their grandchildren. Well, we've now arrived at the point where Socrates must provide some justification for this sharing of women and children by the guardians of the city. How is this policy both consistent with the rest of the Constitution and by far the best? The answer is that the city is best governed when there are no grounds for envy in the guardian class, no grounds for jealousy. This allows the guardians to focus on creating and executing laws that promote the good of the population. Envy is an emotion that can be avoided in large groups when, quote, the vast majority of people apply the words mine and not mine to the same things. When the male guardians share all of the female guardians, and both male and female guardians share all the children born in their generation, then by implication, they are not privatizing these relationships. No one will say of one child, she is mine, thereby excluding access to that child by other guardians, and thereby fomenting jealous anger. Instead, each will say of all the children, these are my children. And each male guardian will say of all the females, they are my wives. In this way, the city will not deteriorate through acts of jealous disputes between the guardians over claims to exclusive possession. Well, that's the end of my chapter 9 in the book from which I'm reading, Understanding Plato, with the title Women, Marriage, and Children. We're going to go on in chapter 10 next week to discuss the famous sun, line, and cave descriptions, which lead to a lot of work that Plato does and Socrates does, a lot of thinking on the concept of justice. So you might think about it. How would metaphors about sun, line, and cave have anything to do with the concept of justice and injustice and morality itself? Well, we'll find out when we discuss next week chapter 10 in my book, Understanding Plato, with the title Sun, Line, and Cave. Thank you very much, and have a good week. We will see you next Monday.